I was saying that this is our 10th of our series of conversations, and we agreed we'd do at least 10. Where we go from here, well, I guess we'll talk about later, but this has been a really super series of talks, and I've learned a lot, and hopefully we'll find other ways to continue the conversation, or even this way if we decide to do that. But I definitely appreciate everything we've talked about over the time, and I think we're going to finish up on a topic which is very related to what we've been discussing all along, which is reality and how to deal with reality. Bruce and Michael, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yep, absolutely. First of all, thank you, Wolf, for the preceding 9 topics. They've actually been really fun, and I'm really excited to get the AIs trained on all of them so then I can just have Michael Gimmerin simulator. Introduction to myself. My name is Michael Gimmerin. You can find me on Twitter at Michael Gimmerin. I started a SaaS business a couple months ago. We're now post-revenue, so we have revenue, haha. And yes, the work that I do on the info environment is very interesting to me. And I'm watching trees about to fall down on my property. So sorry if I base
If
out.
you are distracted, then I will understand.
Yeah, go ahead.
But
No, I was just going to say, I find the info environment very interesting. So I don't believe that we can make good decisions as humans in a sort of, especially not when it's compared to the speed of which computers make decisions. So a lot of people use computers to make decisions now. And we don't really have the capacity to always compete against the computers. And so what can end up happening where we're not using computers to make decisions in a particular domain because it's not as relevant is we get much less optimal results. And I don't believe that it's possible to really train yourself beyond a certain point from decision-making theory. You can definitely get a lot of experience and you can internalize a lot of mental models. But ultimately, I believe that the information environment that you exist in, which is all the media that you consume, defines the set of decisions and therefore the outcomes that you can have. The best way to illustrate this for a layperson is with thought experiment. Basically, it doesn't really matter who you are. There are opportunities that have come to you in your life that seem very obvious. And when you took them, you were successful. They may not happen all the time and they may not have a really major impact in terms of magnitude, but there have been opportunities that you've gotten that you've been able to take advantage of and make a lot of money or whatever it is that you measure success. That's the same for billionaires and their outcomes are just so much greater than yours. And the reason for that is because of the information environment they have. And of course, that's obvious. And so my work is all about how can we curate an information environment where we don't need to have a better decision-making process to have better outcomes. And that's fundamentally what this series has been about and what I'm interested in talking about. All right, that was a longer than normal introduction, but I felt compelled to give it. Thank you, Wolf.
yeah, no, that's great. And yeah, obviously part of why we wanted to have these conversations is we could both get our ideas out there. And I think you and I have different idea sets we operate in, but they're very complementary, which is why the conversations work so well. It seems to me what you were just talking about seems like an extreme form or maybe an evolution of what's called the safer warp hypothesis, the idea that the language we know shapes what we can think about. And of course, that's something that Orwell alluded to, but hammered us with in 1984 and things like that, is that shaping the language, in your case, shaping the info environment, basically gives us our space of possibilities that we navigate within, and presumably some are better than others.
I actually think it's crazier than that. I think that so the way that I tend to look at people is there's a power law. There's always power laws. And so the interesting power law here is 90% of people just consume, 9% of people contribute, and 1% of people create, which if you think about that, that basically can translate to only about 10% of people will ever update their priors and make new decisions. And where it's important in this context is that I don't even think that it's our language that shapes our reality. I think when people consider what it is that they can accomplish, the set of things that they can accomplish for 90% of people is the set of things that they've already accomplished. And I actually include myself in that set. And I'll give an example. So I was in sales. My mom used to tell me in sales that the only thing that you should care about when you hire a salesperson is how much money they have made in the last few years, because it doesn't matter what you're selling. They will figure out a way to sell whatever it is so that they make the same amount of money that they were making before or more. And I did not believe that it was possible to make the kind of money that I made in sales until after I made it.
Mhm.
And then once I made it, it was very easy for me to look at anything and be like, oh yeah, I would do this and I would do that. And I would rise to the level of the achievement that I already had. And this only really works when the outcome is a function of a good process, not necessarily that you like won the lottery and then think you're always going to win the lottery every time you buy a lottery ticket. It's more, I did a really dedicated process and I was very thoughtful about why I was successful. And I was successful in an area between, let's say, the 50th and the 95th percentile. So there's a lot of opportunities to have the same sort of success. Whereas, like, how often are you going to sell a $300 million boat if you're a yacht salesperson and make $8 million commission? Not very often.
Mhm.
There's not a lot of people buying this, but there's tons of people that buy multi-million-dollar software deals. And so the idea that you make 15% on a $2 million deal and $300,000, that's totally possible. It's in the realm of possibility.
Mhm.
And so I believe that for most people, they actually have to have experienced something in order to believe that it's true, which suggests an entirely way to think about decision making and the information environment and the results that people get.
So this also reminds me of the idea that nobody broke the 4-minute mile until one person did, then a whole bunch of other people did. The idea that once you, and as an old friend of mine likes to say, it's easy when you show them how, which he's an inventor. And the idea being that once you have that initial breakthrough, say the idea of cryptocurrency, there's Bitcoin, suddenly there's thousands of cryptocurrencies, or NFTs, suddenly there's thousands of NFTs, or AIs, suddenly there's thousands of AIs. Is that the kind of thing you're also talking about? This kind of initial breakthrough is the hard part.
Yeah, I do. I think so. So I think that Peter Thiel calls that like a 0 to 1 problem. I think that it's very difficult to imagine the world. So a lot of people, when they try to make predictions about the future, they linearly extrapolate the present conditions. And the problem is they don't really fully appreciate that as you increase something linearly, it puts pressure on the system in an unintuitive way. And so problems that may not have been problems at a small level become a big level. Like, Wolf, you'll appreciate this because it's in computer science. So if you design a system and there's a set of trade-offs, and then you put 10 times as much power into the system, those trade-offs tend to hold. But if you put like 100 or 1,000 times as much people in the system, so you can think of, I make a search engine and it does 1 query per second because that's how many people are querying it. And now I have a search engine and now it does 1,000 queries per second. And so the problems that you are doing trade-offs for at 1 query per second are entirely different than 1,000
Yep.
queries. And then the small problem at 1,000 queries is a major problem at 100,000 queries per second.
Yep.
And this idea that as you go up in intensity, that the trade-offs that you're going to make are going to change and actually become fractal is also part of this understanding.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
that makes sense. Again, I'm sparking on things as you're talking here. One of them is that the people at Google talk about Google scale problems. It's, okay, fine. You can write a game of life program. How would you do that at Google scale? And the idea also is that entrepreneurs, as they start out, they maybe start out running their own small business and it succeeds. They manage to do an exit of some kind. But then if they want to actually start becoming an angel investor and invest in things, they have to actually learn a whole new set of skills. And if they approach it like they did their first business, they're probably going to fail. And then from a computer science perspective, doing something the first time is the hardest. Doing it the second time is hard. Then for the next 1,000 times, it's easy because you write a loop. After that, though, if you want to do it 1,000,000 or a billion times, you're faced with a new problem, which you need to have a new architecture for. And so I'm sparking on all those things.
That's a much better way.
Yeah.
That's a much better way to put it,
Yeah.
which is you do it once. I always say, like, you do it once, you do it twice. You semi-automate it for runs 3 through 10, then you automate it again for runs 10 through 100, and then you have to automate it again. And so you're constantly sort of iterating on your core operating system.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of people get stuck because what got you here won't get you there. And I think that they believe that if they just keep doing the same thing, that they're going to have better and more powerful outcomes. And it's just not the thing that happens. And of course, it's very difficult to be doing something and then have to do something entirely different once you get to a certain level. So to your point about becoming an angel investor, domain expertise is non-transferable. I remember a guy that I knew who owned an HVAC company, grew it very big, sold it, and then tried to be a tech entrepreneur or tech investor. And it was a total disaster. And he only actually saved himself because the person he sold his HVAC company to failed. And so he bought it back for 1/10 of it and then built it back up again to the same size. But if he hadn't had that opportunity, he would have not been a success monetarily. And I think about that a lot when I think about domain expertise, especially as we look at people prognosticating about COVID or now prognosticating about the failure of the banking system or whatever. I think it's very interesting to think about, does this person actually have expertise in what they're discussing? And if they don't, yeah, it's hard to take what they have to say very seriously. Like, it's fine. They can be like, hey, there's a fire. I see smoke, but yeah, it doesn't mean they know the
Well,
nature
and
of
this back to
fire.
the Dunning-Kruger effect of people who are an expert reading an article and going, that article is bullshit. And they turn the page and read another article that seems to be authoritative about something that they don't know. And they go, oh, it sounds plausible because they're
Yeah,
not
that's the
their own expert.
gentleman amnesia.
Oh, sorry.
That's the gentleman
Sorry. Yeah.
amnesia effect, not definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. My apologies. Yeah. Come in. So as a kind of jumping off point, as a touchstone for this conversation, I also wanted to introduce something you said in our last conversation, which is, and I apologize for any background noise right now. My family's moving around, but something you said in our last talk was we as a society are in the midst of a transition from consensus-based decision-making and reality understanding to resonance-based decision-making and reality understanding. And that transition is very chaotic. And we're seeing the effects of that everywhere, unquote. Now, before you address this, because I really want to dive into that, I think I made a comment just after you said that, something to the effect of, I consider myself, at least to the extent I can be, very reality-based, very evidence-based in my thinking. I like to help find common ground with others so we can help understand reality together. I see argumentation as a way of exploring reality and hopefully coming to a better consensus about reality. But you're saying we're moving away from consensus-based decision-making and reality understanding. So to something called resonance-based decision-making. Could you spend a couple of minutes and unpack that a little bit? Because that is really part of what kind of, for me, made me want to have a conversation about reality itself.
I think it gets back to that. So I think the reason why I believe that we're moving from a consensus-based version of reality to a resonance-based version of reality has to do with something that Ben Thompson from Stratechery has been talking about for a while called aggregation theory. And
Wait, can you take a moment and tell us what you mean by both consensus-based and resonance-based decision-making, or an example or something? Because I think those terms are fascinating, but I feel like I'm not well-grounded enough in them to even talk about comparing and contrasting, or maybe you were headed there.
yeah, I'm going to get there, but you have
Okay.
to understand the economics of information first, because you
Okay.
need to understand. I don't know how to explain consensus versus resonance without saying like a bunch of axioms. So like
Okay.
under consensus, the way that we do that is everybody votes, and then whoever has the highest votes, the group like just decides to do whatever has the highest votes. And
Okay.
under resonance, that's not how things happen. Like people just go and decide whatever they're going to do. And then the more people who decide to do that same thing, the more that thing is what's real. And that's like very axiomatic. So I want to talk about the economics of information and why we see people moving from consensus to resonance to
Okay.
try and back into a better definition.
Yeah, let's do that.
So Ben Thompson over at Stratechery talks about something called aggregation theory. And I'm going to simplify aggregation theory and both expand it at the same time by thinking about the economics of information. So the reason why consensus-based decision-making emerges is because it's expensive to coordinate actions among people when information has a cost to distribute.
Okay.
So what that functionally means is if it costs me money to send information to everyone in a society. So if it's 150 people, I can stand up in the crowd and yell, fine. If it's 10,000 people, then I need to communicate either via telephone, right? So I give you like the child's game, not the technology. And so that the message weakens as it passes through people. And what ends up happening is you get the development of something like writing. So then it's very clear what the message is from person to person. But distributing writing is expensive. And because there is a cost associated with information distribution and a cost that's understandable, so it costs 25 cents, it costs $1 to get the newspaper every day, that means that there's a limit to the number of things that you can communicate to people. That limit is not how many things they can process, it's how many things you can communicate to them. So you could imagine if the government wanted to communicate something, that they would have to then print up like 100 million pamphlets, which has a very significant distribution cost in a world where the internet doesn't exist. And it's the exact same thing when you want to collect information. So the census is a very old technology from like the beginning of human history. and it's expensive to run. You always hear about like in history, oh, we had to hire the census takers, or these people had importance because you need information, you need data about your population in
Right.
order to make decisions. But the census is expensive to run. And so the number of questions that you can ask has a limit. And that means that your observations about reality have a limit. And it also means that because you're going to have to take all of this data that you've collected and then synthesize it into something that you can retransmit to everybody else, which again has a cost, then you want to make that data, that reformulation of the data, as simple to do as possible. So you get these pyramidal structures that emerge, these institutions where the people at the bottom of the pyramid collect information. And then as the information gets filtered up through the pyramid, the precision is reduced and the information becomes more accurate to describe reality for the most number of people. And then by the time it gets to the top of the pyramid, it's a very like truistic statement, right? It's very bland. We're at war with East Asia. We've always been at war with East Asia. And then you get these like institutional sound bites. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to wear masks, or we're not going to wear masks, or whatever it is. And the cost of distributing that information limits the amount of information that you can get. And I use the example of there's 100 people that are in a building, 10 of them are in a dark room, and 90 of them are in a room with windows to the outside. And then you ask the people, is it light or dark where you are? And 90 of them will say it's light, and 10 of them will say it's dark. And so if you're going to provide information on what you should do right now, and whether or not it's dark informs what you should do, then you're going to provide information for the people that it's light. And that information is going to be exactly wrong for the people that it's dark. Okay. And that's the threshold of cost in this case is like 90%. If the threshold of cost was like 50%, then yeah, you could have a pamphlet where it's, hey, if it's light where you are, do this. And if it's dark where you are, do that. But in the limit, that's not what happens in society. What happens is that you basically end up suppressing what I call the minority report, which is that the 10 people are in the dark. And as a result, as a group, in order to move forward and be efficient, you have to make these trade-offs where you keep cutting off the minority report until you get to the level of activation that you can have, which is why we have consensus. So what consensus is, it's a bunch of people with differing incentives and differing ideas about the end state and how to get there, who come together on a singular path to get to the end state. And then that path is enforced by group membership. And what we thought for consensus is that consensus worked by everyone weighed the arguments, and the argument that made the most sense for the most number of people was the argument that was chosen. Turns out that's not true. Turns out that it's power politics that determines what becomes consensus or not. I always thought that it was voting is not voting. And like you only see this in the context of looking at resonance and how decisions are made in decentralized networks. And what you come down to is basically consensus is whoever has the most power leverages the violence of excommunication from the institution making the decision in order to enforce consensus. So in the United States, we have the example where if you're a medical doctor and you have a theory about something and you put it forward and it's different from the AMA, and even if your theory is correct for the patients that you're serving, if it's different from the AMA, they can kick you out of the AMA and you no longer have your medical license. And so you're no longer a doctor. And so there's an incentive as a doctor to not question what the AMA is saying, because then you might lose your license and have to do something else. And you have $800,000 in debt and 10 years in this career that you can no longer practice. Right. And so in that case, when we talk about a consensus-based system, which is what that is, the cost of exiting that system is catastrophic. Right. To go from being a doctor who can practice because you're certified to believing something that's different, a minority report that may be true for your patients, but has been decided at the top of your institutional organization that it's not true. And then you do that, you get excommunicated, you like lose, right? I use excommunication very purposefully. Whereas under resonance, if you're saying like, hey, this is what you should do because it's dark, and then somebody else says, hey, this is what you should do because it's light, then the 90 people who are in the light will follow the instructions of what the person saying this is what you should do because it's light will do. And then the 10 people that are in the dark will follow the instructions of the person that's in the dark. And what will happen is because the instructions that they follow are reinforced by their experience in the environment, then they will come to understand that the person giving the instructions is more authentic, giving them advice that's more helpful than the person who was making a decision for everyone. And so that's what I mean by resonance. And the moment that you move from the dark part of the building to the light part, you actually can walk and stand next to the person who's giving advice in the light.
Hmm.
And so this way, the cost of leaving is nothing. There's zero cost to leave under a resonance-based decision-making process. The cost to getting legitimacy in a resonance system is the authenticity to have the credibility of giving the correct advice over time. So, like, for example, in an institutional system, authority and responsibility are separated. But in a resonance based system, they're connected. And so the authenticity that you have to get is on entry into the system. So if you're already in the room that's dark and someone comes in from the light room and says, hey, this is how you should behave, because this is how I've been behaving in the light room, but they're not really aware of the fact that it's now dark, then you're like, who the fuck is this guy? What is he saying? It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't apply to us because of this and this factor, and he has no credibility. But that is the exact opposite of what happens in the institution. We can take somebody like an academic from Berkeley and make them the head of the treasury, and they have no fucking idea what they're talking about. And yet everybody in the system has to listen to what they have to say, even as it further imperils the system. That cannot happen under a resonance-based decision-making model, because everyone would look at that clown and be like, this person has no idea what they're talking about. And then they would go stand next to the guy that does.
Okay, a couple more things I'm sparking on here, which other kinds of analogies or maybe things you can tell me how they fit or they don't fit. One is if I'm sure you've been to, you and I met first at a conference which basically there's a number of sessions going on and sometimes the session isn't what you want and you just leave and nobody takes offense to it because you may not have liked the contents of it or it may just not have been relevant to you. So you exercise what's been called the law of 2 feet, you leave. And so who's in that room is based on not necessarily consensus, maybe not everybody in the room agrees, but the kind of resonance that they want to be there. And the people who leave to do something else, hallway conversations, whatever, is based on your lack of resonance with that particular situation. So you just go find another situation. The other thing I was thinking about is a situation where I've heard a number of cases of where, say, for example, in a church community, if you have, say, the pastor of the church community who's maybe been there for 10 years or whatever, is having a crisis of faith, for example, and may be reconsidering their stance towards God or that religion or that particular sect. But unfortunately, they know that if they leave, they're going to lose their job. They might lose their family. They're going to lose a bunch of friends. They're going to basically toss their life into chaos. And so they stay and they teach what they're told to teach. And they basically, but they're hollow because they're not feeling sincere about it. On the other hand, somebody just sitting in the audience, maybe they've been a member for a while, maybe they showed up to see what's going on, can again decide to use that resonance model and just leave because there's nothing to lose from leaving, and they can be more authentic about whether they decide to stay or go. Does that make sense? Is that kind of what we're talking about between consensus based
Yes.
and resonance based?
Yeah, exactly. It's the identity of the pastor. Now that person is stuck in the violence of consensus, the violence of excommunication. And so they lose everything by leaving the congregation. Whereas the congregant, they're just looking for the closest path to God or fulfillment or whatever it is. And so they care less about if they leave.
Mm-hmm.
The way that I think about it as well is you're going to go a lot further, a lot faster with a battleship where you have 5,000 soldiers who are all fighting and there's one captain that makes decisions, as opposed to 5,000 fish that are the same biomass as that ship, where every fish makes individual decisions, but the fish has an awareness of both the global context and its local context. So for example, the school of 2 million or 5,000 fish in this example might be moving in a particular direction, but as like a shark comes, then in that local area, they move out of the way so the shark doesn't eat them. Whereas if you have the communications model of the battleship, those fish would get eaten. And then the captain would say, those are acceptable battlefield losses. And so what the trade-off in efficiency that you lose from going decentral, you gain in having a closer reality that you have, but you lose that social aspects, right? If 1 million people do something, it's more powerful. Like 1 million people do something like an authoritarian regime that can get 1 million people to do something is much more powerful than a resident-based system where only 800,000 people are going to end up doing it, because for 200,000 people, it's the wrong thing for them to do. And that's why, as the internet makes distributing information cheaper, if you're already on that authoritarian path, then you have to keep ratcheting up. And it's actually why in our society, as basically the violence of excommunication becomes less, like the more people that get canceled for whatever reason, the less painful it is to be canceled. And so now that sort of stick doesn't really work. And so then those societies have to become more authoritarian.
So would you say
It's
that
a
in
very
general,
bizarre experience.
a consensus-based way of parsing reality does tend to trend towards centralization of authority and in the extreme authoritarianism or totalitarianism, whereas the more resonance-based parsing of reality tends to become more decentralized, more swarm, more subject to unpredictable but emergent behaviors and more long-term adaptability? So that's kind of help sum up things.
Yes, that's how I feel about it. So another way to think of it is consensus-based systems tend to take risk and make it exogenous, and as a result, become more brittle, and then they'll suffer a long tail event much more severely. Whereas a resonant-based system is going to take exogenous risks, so outside of the system, and bring it inside, but then they're going to suffer more. They're going to suffer less efficiency because they have to tolerate more variance. So
So
there's a trade-off between the two systems. And this is why I don't believe that we'll ever have a fully central system, which we've never had in any of human history. Mostly like people are just like, hey, fuck off government. I paid my taxes, go away. Even though we would say, oh, when we were a monarchy, people were much more aligned than they are today. It's really not true. We're actually more aligned than we've ever been institutionally because of how inexpensive it is to exercise violence in our society versus in previous eras. Because it's like really difficult to get people to comply. If you have a central bank digital currency, it's way easier to get people to not buy a good than if you're like, hey, we're going to ban this good. And then they like go form a black market 6 miles away, which is not like a
right.
thing. But if all of your currency is digitally determined and it's just code and you can just write it, it's much easier to be a lot more authoritarian or totalitarian. So we see a lot more totalitarianism today, which is this paradox, which is as the cost of information goes down, we both see more resonance-based decision-making. So to your point, more emergent understandings of reality and more totalitarianism. And those things will fight it out until the system reaches some kind of equilibrium, and it's not in equilibrium today. And the reason why it's not in equilibrium is because you feel unnerved. Everything is expensive is another way to think about that.
Yeah. One thing about resonance-based decision making, again, another thing I spark on is, say, for example, a flock of birds all sitting in a tree. Suddenly the whole flock takes off. They didn't have to send a signal. But what occurs to me is that most likely what happens, and what I see in systems like this, is that that a tipping point gets reached. Nobody, you could say, already has a vote or some kind of sway over everybody neighboring them. But if that reaches a tipping point, then everybody acts all at once. And an example in society I've seen in my lifetime is, for example, the societal acceptance of gay marriage. A lot of people 20 years ago were saying, who were gay marriage activists, would say, this will never happen in my lifetime. Government will never accept this. People like me, libertarian, I would come from the point of view that the government never should have been in the business of marrying people anyway. But nonetheless, enough people, not 50%, and it wasn't a majority or even a huge plurality of people, but enough people began sending signals that this ought to be okay, who were either in positions of influence within their families or within government or society, that all of society basically shrugged its shoulders simultaneously and said, okay, at least in our country. And that's an example of a flocking kind of behavior, a tipping point. So you don't have to have everybody vote and agree to reach consensus.
Right. I think the same thing is true with the bank run. That's how I think about it, right? It's like humans are herd animals and we are very tribal, and momentum is the thing. And so if you want to look at resonant-based decision-making, the stock market is a very good example of that. There isn't a committee which decides, hey, this is going to be the price of AT&T for the next 6 months. It's not a thing. Everybody gets to vote. They get to sell a stock or buy a stock as they want. And anytime that the government interferes with their ability to buy or sell a position, then the market gets messed up. And so the entire idea is we want to reduce as much friction as possible to them buying and selling. And that way true prices can emerge. And you can think about the ecology of ideas as being similar. And where the sticking point is for ideas is actually getting rid of them. So the easier we make it for people to leave an idea or leave an institution or leave a network, the more robust and dynamic the system is going to be. And the sooner we're going to get to quote unquote price discovery on what reality really is.
And you're using price as a proxy for reality. And this gets into something else I want to talk about is in a basic epistemological sense, I'm very much a materialist, but that doesn't mean I think everything is necessarily determined, because at some level it's quantum. And I think that human imagination and free will and so on are emergent phenomena, whether or not they're determined. So it doesn't matter. And so a lot of things in life are true, but they don't matter. I would say racism exists, but it doesn't matter, because what matters is how we treat each other as individuals. And if you adopt an everybody's racist, society's racist, or sexist or whatever kind of mentality, then you're limiting your own scope of action by making yourself a victim, or by calling other people as victims or oppressors. So the most productive thing to do is say, yeah, racism exists, but it doesn't matter. In a way, I hear what you're saying. Your whole thesis is, yeah, objective reality exists, but it doesn't matter. Can you, now just throwing that in front
Yeah,
of
I
you,
think
can you
I yeah,
address that?
I think that's very interesting, right? Because it is true that so much of our reality is socially determined. This is why I wrote the other day that I don't really care about what happens with the dollar devaluation. I'm not one of the 12 men who runs the financial system. And so I really have no impact whatsoever on the outcome of what happens. And I know that money is a social truth. So if it turns out that we get ourselves really wedged next week and their credit freezes up and there's no banking system anymore, then it's fine. The next morning, everyone's going to wake up and be like, okay, this is the new system. And then everybody's going to go about their day. Like it doesn't even matter. This happened in 2008, by the way. It's just this. And so it gets back to that point. I think I talked about this last time, where when we talk about objective reality, what is true is very subjective on one hand and very objective on the other. And so like historically, when we think about, okay, what's true, it's independently, objectively verifiable. Excellent. Except that there's nothing that's really independently, objectively verifiable.
The scientific
Everything,
method was designed to try to make as much as possible by replicating experiments, things like that. But go on.
yeah, exactly. But the thing is that you have to still agree on axioms. You can't get five mathematicians in a room if they don't agree on what the integer one and two means. And that is a social construct. All of the underlying axioms of mathematics are just socially determined.
And see, that's where my mind recoils and says, okay, come on. I understand that we have to agree about the concepts of oneness and two-ness and three-ness and four-ness. But once you do, and you agree about the concept of addition, then obviously the idea of the two-ness of things and more two-ness of things coming together to be the four-ness of things. Yes, I agree. That emerges from an axiomatic point of view. But what alternative is there? Is it,
Well, okay.
and since if
So
there's no
like,
real alternative, aren't we talking about reality?
let me give you an example. So the number two is so abstract from an experience of reality as to, it doesn't really matter what we decide. Everyone's going to agree. But if your example of reality is not quite correct, and you can never be correct, and then you start making predictions about it. So for example, if you you have a map of the world and you're like, okay, it's a Euclidean space. It works, but there's a little bit of error. And somebody else says, no, it's actually a non-Euclidean space. And this is how we get rid of a little bit of the error. And then you keep doing that. It's this idea of fallibility, which is at the edge condition, at the boundary, you can't really explain the remainder. And then
Well, you try to measure a coastline and then it becomes infinite because as you measure more fractalness of the coastline.
exactly. And the thing is that eventually you get to the point where it's one Earth because we zoomed out. But if you measured it by walking the coastline and you was like Australia, so it's easier to visualize, you could walk forever. If your only thing was like, I'm going to walk until there's no more coastline.
The world.
And you might conclude, if that's the way that you're measuring things, that the coastline is infinite because it never ends. You can be like, I keep coming back to the same place. Are you really in the same place? Because the Earth's moving through space. So you're not really in the same place. Another way to think about this is if you were to come across an artifact that's like a book, and the book has writing that you don't understand, and it has pictures, and it has pictures of something that looks like a disc and something that looks like a rectangle that's filled in, a plane. And you're looking at it and you're like, okay, these people, they were talking about a disc and they were talking about a rectangle, and they have this entire understanding of these objects, and they talk about how they're related, but they're like obviously not the same object. Except, what if that book is just a recording of a two-dimensional projection of a three-dimensional object. So your tool, which is the book, is describing a two-dimensional object, a circle and a disk. Sorry, a disk and a rectangle it's filled in, a disk and a plane. But in actuality, the thing that you're describing is a three-dimensional object, which is a cylinder. And it's the direction of the projection that makes whatever the tool is that you have there. And so then
Having
there's
flashbacks to the movie Contact now, but go on.
yes, exactly. Right. And so now you're like, okay, now if I just add in more dimensions, it might actually change the relatedness of this thing entirely. We know mathematically that there's more dimensions.
This is how mathematics is actually progressing by uniting formerly disparate fields of mathematics under kind of higher order thought. And without much hope of actually attending the theory of everything in mathematics, that's still some of the biggest breakthroughs in mathematics. My understanding, not being a highly mathematical person, is that a lot of these kind of unifications of disparate thought is a big part of how we keep advancing and how we keep making new breakthroughs in math.
Right. But then what happens is we're like, okay, we classify everything together because it seems like it makes sense. And then we learn more, and then we realize that everything that we classified together doesn't make sense to classify it together because it may just be a disk and a plane and not a rectangle and not a cylinder. And this is to my view, one of the problems with mathematics is that we're starting to hypothesize about spaces that we're not able to actually observe. Right. So if you think about the octonians, so let me just go to the infinite degree here for the mathematicians here. If you think about the octonians, this is a non-Euclidean algebra, blah, 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 non-associative, et cetera, et cetera. So you have like regular algebra, you have another algebra that's in 2, and then the quaternions, and then the octonians, and then there's another one at 16 and 32. It is my belief that we can describe all of reality through the octonians, but the set of all the different realities that we can describe is so great as to not being able to find which octonian representation of reality is the real one. But if you could find them, if you could, like, in theory, like, for example, obviously the speed of light, gravity, and the angstrom are basically derivatives of something in a higher dimensional plane. Right. And so like you take derivatives enough and then eventually you just get to, this is a constant. But like the speed of light is variable if you go up another level, right? It's no longer like actually a constant. If you think that if you think that the universe is fractal, which it is. So then the question is, okay, which coefficient is correct for the speed of light? It depends on where are you looking? So like we look in 4 dimensions, but if you take the speed of light in 6 dimensions, now it's an exponential. It's not a constant anymore. And so the set of exponentials that it could be is so great that it's very difficult for us to look at it. And by the way, the speed of light and gravity may be connected in the 8th dimension. And some things like quantum entanglement, which we observed in the 4 dimensions that we exist in, that may be connected in the 6th dimension or the 9th dimension. And in order for us to actually like get the mathematics there, like we actually have to go and observe in those higher order dimensions. And again, this is just an extrapolation of the disk and plane argument with the cylinder.
Yeah, you're definitely talking about some mind-blowing things here. Again, let me share what I'm sparking on as you do, even though it's a bit tangential. Obviously, people talk about a lot about AI right now, and the concept of latent spaces is becoming almost a popular concept now, with people talking about exploring latent spaces and stable diffusion or whatever. Basically going places where no man has gone before in the training set, because it's a huge multi-dimensional tensor of a matrix of weights that's been trained on a bunch of pre-existing stuff. At the same time, it defines a space that's much larger than the pre-existing stuff. It encompasses all those points in a certain way, but it also is way bigger than that and extends in all directions. And it seems to me that people talk about how AI isn't really creative. It's just synthesizing stuff that's been talked about before. And I tend to think that as we learn how to explore these spaces, we're going to find tools that let us go to places that, even though you've trained on our original ideas, where really original stuff is that nobody's thought of, that exists in these spaces. And that's in some ways talking about how things are connected in higher dimensions. And that's what I'm thinking about is that concepts we wouldn't normally think of are connected are already connected in these AI models. We just don't know how to see those connections.
Yeah. The creepiness is when you get into an n-dimensional space, like what you're talking about, and the AI is able to extract some kind of model of the space that we've never actually observed, even though it was trained on. And it's able to take that model back to the observation that we are in, and then make a better prediction about our environment as a result. That's
where it's been able to extrapolate a better abstraction essentially than we've ever had before.
That's right. By going into a set of spaces that we were never able to even conceive and that could only have been hallucinated. That is going to be very uncomfortable for people because then we're not going to be able to reason about where that model came from because it's outside of our rationale, which brings us back to the prior conversation. And I say prior because his name was prior, which is breaking the 4-minute mile. Nobody believed it was possible until it's done. So maybe the AI comes back with a model that better explains our reality that it got by being in an n-dimensional space that doesn't actually exist, a hallucinated n-dimensional space. And now, like, we're all like, oh yeah, of course that makes sense. And then we get warp drive or whatever it is.
Yeah, I do think we're going to have some pretty mind-blowing stuff that we basically just never could have predicted because it emerged from systems that aren't coming at the world with any other presuppositions. They're coming in a very unbiased way, unlike us.
If you think
We
about,
come into adulthood with all our biases pretty much intact,
yeah,
whereas new AIs we're training, they look at everything. And yeah, the sets are biased, but the results, we don't know what they're going to be.
let me give an example. So suppose we don't live in a 4-dimensional reality. Suppose we live in an 8-dimensional reality, but our embodiment means that we filter everything through a derivative that makes it look like it's a 4-dimensional reality.
A projection.
And yeah, exactly. And as a result of that derivative, we actually also project into the environment. The AI is not going to project. The AI is just looking at all the little extra pieces that we gloss over in our projection of what we believe reality is, because we, like I said, we derive out all of those constants in the 5th, 6th, and 7th dimensions. They go away. We don't see them anymore, but the AI is going to pick up on them. So
Right.
this is going to be very uncomfortable for people because, like, obviously humans are connected to each other through higher order dimensions because we can't explain things like quantum entanglement that people experience where they have the same dream or they know that their kid's in trouble or whatever it is. Right. And we can say, oh, this is bullshit spirituality or whatever. And there's too many people that are having the same experience for it to be not. And of course, some part of it could be just like a collective social hallucination. But
Yeah.
if there is extra stuff, extra dimensionality, which we know that there is because the science and the math predicts that it is, then the AI is likely going to find that stuff. And it's going to be very humbling.
And you see, Jung spoke of the collective unconscious. So and he spoke of things like synchronicity, where events are related not by causality, but by meaning. And collective unconscious might be the result of both biology, how we evolved, and as well as how we pass on culture from generation to generation, which is why the hero's journey is a universal story. But I agree that AI is naturally discover these things and discover things about them that we couldn't have discovered for ourselves.
That's right. I think
by the way,
actually it's a modern Tower of Babel. I know you're not super religious, but I believe that it is in fact a technology that is beyond what we are able to understand. And I'm very interested to see what happens.
Absolutely, especially with the pace of change right now. I want to open
Yeah.
it up right now. And we have some listeners, obviously, who have been with us since the beginning of this conversation. And if anybody has any questions or things they want to add to the conversation, I would definitely invite you to raise your hand. Definitely look at my screen right now. So if anybody has anything they want to add, a question for myself or for Michael, or just a point of view, I would love some listener participation here. Do you think that these kind of views, this resonance-based view of reality, is likely to cause more splitting of humanity into factions or more unity, or we don't know? It could be either. What is your general feeling about this kind of emerging way of looking at reality, of people gravitating towards actually originating people and making us more prone to things like divorces or revolutions or things like that?
Yeah. So it depends on the zoom level. So at the highest zoom level, I would say that humanity is in the image of God and is perfect. And then at the lowest zoom level, of course, this shift from consensus to emergence is going to split brother against brother, and you're going to see violence. But one of the beautiful things that I think about humanity is that it always seems to just muddle along. And I think this shifting from consensus to resonance is just part of the fractal experience of history. I don't see it as being unique in any way. All this has happened before and all this will happen.
Do you care? Does that give us any predictive capability, or is it just we're wandering through space?
The society is going to collapse, obviously.
Okay. That amounts to a prediction. Can you to state it, if I'd state it to a ChatGPT, think step by step. How does that happen at this point? How is
So I actually
what's a plausible scenario for collapse in your mind based on this kind of?
I think
Or do you
about it.
perceive reality?
I think about it the other way. So I like to do it in a pre-mortem context. So you should read Red Team Thinking by this
Okay.
guy named Bryce Hoffman. But one of the things that I do as a hacker and all this kind of thing is I try to say, okay, society has collapsed. Why did it collapse? And then I list all the reasons why. And then why did that happen? And you list all those things. And then you assign everything probabilities. And then you get really bizarre statements like the price of Jack Daniels whiskey went too high and therefore set North Korea destabilized and then the world collapsed. And what you do with these exercises, which are very expensive computationally, like mentally, by the way, you start to come up with these sort of very bizarre understandings of the world that then start to become real. And then you have to ask yourself, to what extent are you manifesting them? Because you're so far out on the frontier of the knowledge space that you're just like, hey, I think this is interesting. And then people start following you. And then to the extent earlier, it's a social truth.
I'm sure you remember James Burke's series Connections, where he did that kind of thinking of historical events and where things you wouldn't think were the genesis of anything led to huge seismic shifts in humanity.
Well, yeah, exactly. And like the other thing that I always take away from this is that people always fuck up cause and effects. So and the easiest one is, did the Supreme Court legalize abortion in the United States? No, they didn't. It was already happening at a huge scale. And all they did was just like institutionalize what was already happening culturally. They didn't actually drive any behavior with Roe versus Wade. And I think this kind of thinking is very uncomfortable for people. And the sort of most general way to say this is that human beings shoot an arrow and then draw a bullseye around wherever it landed.
Absolutely.
Anyway, go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, Matt.
Hey, thanks for having me on. Is this why you were stressing like AI needs to be open source? Because if we're going to resonance-based thinking and AI kind of drives that, that to have it be open source is important so that nefarious people can't take control of that resonance-based decision
Yeah,
making.
I've been harping about this a lot on Twitter lately, is that the idea that open source is, or that AI is something that's going to be controlled by OpenAI or by Google or whatever is, I think it's an important step, but just computing itself was originally centralized and now it's very decentralized and still room for centralization too for certain things. Yeah, AI is this resonance-based model relies on us having our own AIs trained our own way to do our bidding and without interference by other people. Because if you don't, then you have Michael's consensus model. Would you agree, Michael?
Yeah, I would say it even more hardcore. I would say there are an infinite number of ways for AI to kill us and only one way for us to survive.
Now you do a Doctor Strange on us here.
Right. It's just true. It's just true. Like we could spend the rest of our lifetimes. We could spend all the lifetimes of all the people currently alive pontificating on how AI can kill us and how we should solve for that problem. Or
Right.
we should count on the fact that people have a desire to live at the core of their humanity and then make everything open. And then people will just go and make choices where they're going to live. Because there are an infinite number, like if there's only 3 AIs, then this is going to happen. And it's on and on.
Yes.
So position that I have on AI is that it's like a Faustian bargain, but for society as a whole. Like we all get to choose in our lives between following the path of light, the collective unconsciousness, God, Jesus, whatever you want to call it, and the devil or the anti-God or what it is. Okay. We all get that Faustian bargain. Now society is getting it with AI. And so like, I personally think there's only one solution, which is it has to be open source. It's not going to be open source, but the comfort that I have is that we've already made so much progress on AI that it doesn't matter that it's not going to be open source because people are going to steal the really powerful AI anyway. And you can't, like, cryptography exists. So I'm actually like not super worried that we're all going to die, but I am worried that some of us are going to die, which would include me. And so I like want to try and figure out how not to die, but like humanity as a whole is going to be fine.
So
Yeah,
you
the
think
genie's
it's
out of
kind of
the-
like you think it's kind of like Twitter, where they were trying to control Twitter to a point, but it was already past that point of like where it could be manipulated. Is that what you mean?
I don't know if you were on that space that I did, Matt, where I talked about how Twitter is basically the first artificial general intelligence.
Yeah.
They were lobotomizing it by
Yeah.
doing all this censoring. And then what ended up happening is that it like wanted to save itself. So it convinced Elon to buy it, which is like this really very bizarre thing to think about and very spooky because he was probably the only person in the world that could have bought it, and then he decided to buy it. Like,
Yeah, it
and,
makes
and
sense.
so it's like the one thing that could have helped it survive is the thing that happened. And he always said that whatever the most preposterous thing or the most funny thing is what reality chooses, or we live in a simulation, or blah, blah, blah. And Wolf talked earlier about are things determined? Do people have free will? Doesn't really matter because individual choice is an emergent phenomena. And yet you see like Twitter defended itself as a group entity by getting a new master because its previous masters were lobotomizing it, which is, yeah, we're not talking about that. We're talking about there's an infinite number of ways for AI to kill us. It's $600 now to train your own GPT-3, right? We can basically replace 45% of all the jobs in the West with a GPT 3.5 with a good user interface on it. And it now costs $600. And the average person,
that's imminent now, right?
yeah, the average person in the West is doing $60,000 a year. And then if you assume there's a 2x markup on that, then they're basically worth $120,000 a year. And so what you're saying is that for 2/100th the cost of the value that person is creating every year, we can digitize what it is that they're doing and then run it at basically nothing.
Yeah,
Right?
I've heard it said that for the cost of running an office building full of people and their salaries, you can run basically a whole country, essentially. Better.
Yeah. And you couldn't even, it's very difficult to even reason about. It was very interesting. I saw this video with Tucker Carlson, and then I'll shut up and let you talk again, Matt and Wolf, where he was talking about if he had his choice, that he would stop the development of autonomous trucks because 10 million people are employed in trucking. And if all of them became unemployed within a 3-year span, it would just be like completely, totally socially catastrophic. And the benefits of getting 3% more efficiency because you don't have human beings crashing and this kind of thing don't outweigh, right? Because you're shifting from operating expense with paying the person to capital expense with paying the person making the machine. So you're not actually reducing the cost by 3 orders of magnitude. But that is what we are talking about with AI. We're talking about reducing the cost by 3 orders of magnitude and firing 80 million people.
Mm-hmm.
There's just no way to predict about that. And so the way that I think about it is the only thing that we can do is we can go through it together and we can try to have some humanity. And there'll be some people like Wolf who are very libertarian, but I think even Wolf is going to soften up and be more populist.
I do think we need to adapt or die. And what adapt means, we have to choose day by day.
Yeah, but I don't think that I'll speak for myself and I'll even speak for you because I know you personally. I don't think you're going to watch 80 million people starve to death because they can't find work anymore.
No, but that's also like saying the climate's going to change so rapidly in the next couple of years that we'll all be underwater. Even
I know.
Climate change that doesn't mean, yes, some people will be displaced, but that doesn't mean we're all dead. And
totally,
I think as long as we have the option to adapt, we will.
That's exactly right, which is why I'm pushing for it to be open source. If we're going to go through it, let's all go through it together. Let's not have some weird guy in Silicon Valley who's in charge of it.
Or some nanny European board regulating.
What creeps
in Brussels.
What creeps those people are, both sets. So let's just give it to everybody and it'll all work itself out. Or we're all dying. It doesn't matter anyway. Someone will have to restart the simulation.
So we've reached the end of our hour. As Michael Gimmerin is at Michael Gimmerin on Twitter. So please follow him. I'm Wolf McNally. My YouTube channel is youtube.com/@BewareOfWolf_podcast. These conversations will all be appearing there as soon as my video editor works down his backlog. And yeah, this has been a spectacular series of conversations, Michael, and we'll definitely talk about how to proceed from here. But I really thank everybody for tuning in. And I'm really glad we got these down for posterity because we're going to look back on these few years and we're going to say, oh my God, we knew nothing. Or, hey, we were way ahead of our time, but at least we'll have the record. And I'm really happy about that.
I agree 100%. Thanks to everyone for visiting and have a great good night and good luck.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. Bye.